Millie Alcock just crossed the $100 million mark. That sounds like a win. It is not, because the last DC movie to hit that number did it in 3 days. Supergirl needed 10. And on the very weekend she crossed that line, she got beaten at the box office by a movie about George Washington. So today we're breaking down exactly how a $200 million superhero movie ended up losing to a founding father. Grab your cape, or don't, because apparently that's part of the problem too, that if this is your first time here, I track box office numbers the way other people track their fantasy football league, obsessively and with way too many spreadsheets. So let's get into the receipts. Here's the setup. In 2025, Warner Brothers relaunched the DC universe from scratch. New continuity, new actors. A clean slate after years of the old DC extended universe never quite finding its footing. The opening chapter was Superman, with David Cornsweet taking over the cape from Henry Cavill. It made about $619 million worldwide. Not a home run, but a clear, respectable win, and it ended the year as the highest-grossing superhero movie of 2025, ahead of Marvel's Fantastic Four reboot. That set up Chapter 2, Supergirl, starring Millie Alcock, directed by Craig Gillespie. And this was supposed to be the movie that proved the new DC universe could work without James Gunn directly in the director's chair. It did not go that way. Let's start with the number everyone's using to make this sound better than it is. $100 million global. Sounds impressive on its own, but strip away the context, and that number is basically meaningless. Superman hit $100 million globally by the end of its very first Friday. 3 days. It made more than that from the domestic opening weekend alone. Supergirl took 10 days to reach the same milestone. That's more than triple the time. And the way it got there tells you everything. 58.5 million domestic, 42 million international. Nearly half of that total came from second weekend that should have been building momentum, not scraping toward a number Superman blew past before its marketing campaign even finished running. A milestone isn't just about hitting a number. It's about how fast you get there. And speed is exactly the thing Supergirl doesn't have right now. Now here's where it gets genuinely rough. Supergirl opened domestically at $37 million, below already lowered tracking, which had predicted around $55 million. That's a soft open for a movie with a reported production budget between $170 and $186 million before you even add marketing. But opening weekends only tell half the story. The real test is what happens next. Does the audience come back? Does word of mouth carry it? For Supergirl, the answer is a hard no. Weekend 2 dropped somewhere between 73 and 80% domestically, depending on which tracking service you check. Box Office Mojo has it around 74%. That is one of the worst second weekend collapses for any comic book movie ever released. For comparison, 2025 Superman only dropped about 53% in its second weekend. That gap right there is the entire story. Where does Supergirl's drop actually rank? It's steeper than The Flash, steeper than Morbius, steeper than Black Adam, steeper than the Marvels by some counts. The only comic book movie it's still ahead of is Joker Folie, Deux, which fell around 81% and is widely considered one of the biggest theatrical disasters in franchise movie history. Being the second worst is not a flex. And here's the detail that stings the most. On the same holiday weekend, Supergirl got outgrossed by Young Washington, an Angel Studios historical drama about George Washington, made for a fraction of the budget. That film actually built momentum, pulling in a 92% positive audience score, while Supergirl slid to fourth place at the box office behind two family animated films and an indie period piece. Oh, what went wrong? This is where it gets interesting, because the reviews don't tell the full story either. Critics were mixed, landing Supergirl in the mid-50s on Rotten Tomatoes. But the verified audience score sits at 76%. That's a real gap, and normally a strong audience score is exactly what saves a shaky opening. Remember Pixar's Elemental? Soft debut, incredible legs, ended up making almost $500 million worldwide because word of mouth kept building. Supergirl didn't get that bounce, and reporting from inside the production explains part of why. According to The Hollywood Reporter, DC Studios actually ran test screenings comparing two different cuts of the film, one for director Craig Gillespie and one shaped more heavily by the studio. Normally test scores climb as a film gets closer to release. Supergirl scores reportedly went the other direction, staying in the 60s, with one insider saying the highest score the film ever hit was 70. Sources describe creative friction between Gillespie and studio leadership over the film's direction, though not everyone involved agrees on how serious that tension actually was. Add to that a genuinely brutal release calendar. Supergirl launched right into a summer packed with Toy Story 5, Minions and Monsters, and heavy anticipation building for Spider-Man Brand New Day. Superhero movies also aren't the automatic box office lock they were a decade ago. Combine an unproven headline character, since the only prior Supergirl solo film was the widely mocked 1984 version, with a packed summer schedule and a production that reportedly never fully resolved its creative direction, and you get exactly this kind of result. DC Studios co-chief Peter Safran addressed the numbers directly, telling the New York Times that Supergirl falling short of expectations doesn't change the studio's broader long-term plan, which he says the studio still stands behind. Translation: one movie isn't going to blow up the whole universe. And to be fair, that's a reasonable position. Supergirl's break-even point is estimated around $300 million, which is roughly $260 million lower than what Superman needed to clear. It's a smaller bet than it looks like from the headlines. But the math is still ugly. Some estimates put potential losses for Warner Brothers as high as $120 million once marketing spend is factored in. And that's before considering a slowing back half of July, as the film loses screens to make room for The Odyssey and Spider-Man Brand New Day. What's next for the DC Universe? Clayface arrives in October on a much leaner budget, somewhere around $80 million, which lowers the pressure considerably. After that, Superman gets a direct sequel, Man of Tomorrow, in 2027, with James Gunn confirming Millie Alcock will return as Supergirl in a much bigger role. There's also an HBO Lantern series in the pipeline, and an eventual Batman project still without a firm date. So the studio isn't retreating. But there's now a real question sitting underneath all of it. Reports have also surfaced suggesting some filmmakers are growing more hesitant to sign onto DC projects after watching how the Supergirl production played out internally. Whether that's a passing narrative or an actual pattern is something we'll only know once we see how the next film comes together. Here's the honest read. Supergirl is not the disaster some headlines are making it sound like, and it's also not the modest bump Safran is describing. It sits somewhere in between. It is, by almost every meaningful metric, the first real stumble for the new DC universe. Not a universe-ending stumble, but a real one, with real financial consequences attached. The audience score tells us the movie itself isn't the core problem. Plenty of people who bought a ticket walked out satisfied. The bigger issue is that almost nobody who skipped opening weekend decided to show up later, and not a marketing and positioning problem as much as a filmmaking one. What happens with Clayface in October will tell us a lot. A confident bounce back, and Supergirl becomes a footnote. Another underperformance, and the conversation around this entire relaunch changes completely. So that's where things stand. A $100 million milestone that took 3 times longer than it should have. A second weekend collapse that ranks among the worst in comic book movie history, and a studio insisting the long game is still intact. If you want the numbers explained like this, breakdowns without the hype and without the doom posting, subscribe, and I'll keep tracking this one all the way through October when Clayface lands. What do you think actually went wrong here? Drop your take in the comments. I read all of them, and I will absolutely argue with you about box office math in there. See you in the next one.